on tech is Section 230, or whole notion of speech on the internet. This is the section of the 96 Communications Act that allows platforms, but importantly, not just big platforms. If you're a company, then you have a comment site, you're protected by 230. So it's obviously a big debate. I don't believe that the Biden administration and his top supporters have said they want to abolish the 230 protections. I don't believe that's going to happen. You got people like Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat in the Senate, who sponsored that bill still. I think there'll be some kind of reforms towards that, but I don't believe there will be abolishment. Another area is telecom, just really quickly on that. We have this bizarre, I don't know, to me it's bizarre focus on net neutrality. It's never been a problem. I don't think it ever will be a problem. And we keep going, before Obama, we didn't have any rules. Everything was fine. Then it was classified as Title II in the FCC, like a telephone service. Then Trump, it wasn't, and now it will be. There's no question it will be. The FCC will definitely do that. Whatever. The key issue there really is, do they sort of go beyond that and start imposing other kind of restrictions on broadband carriers? The more important issue to me is broadband stimulus, and I really think there will be a stimulus package for broadband, and I think it'll be two big areas. One will be rural broadband deployment. We're giving money to carriers to deploy broadband in unserved or underserved areas, and the second big area will be, I believe will be something on the digital divide, some sort of better system of subsidies for low-income families. I mean, that just came to home so much in the COVID lockdown, where there were poor families that had to have their kids go to school online, and they had a lot of problems. Not everybody, but some people had real problems with that. So there's a real recognition in Congress that we got to do something on that. And so I believe there will be some efforts made around getting more people ability to afford a broadband at home. Another area where I'm actually more positive about, and that's investment. One of the complaints I would make about the Trump administration is they really didn't do anything around public investment in these areas. So I think there's been a lot more money for e-government. The federal government in particular is just, their systems are lagging dramatically behind best-in-class private sector systems. I think there'll be something on smart cities. We have a new report coming out on smart cities. I think there could be some real funding on that. And I think the way it might work out is competitions between regions. So, if your region wants to be a smart city region, you could probably, if this happens, which I think it could, there might be some kind of national competition. You apply, cities commit to doing interesting things around sensors and AI and other things for smart cities. Smart electric grid, more effort to digitize our health system and get more AI involved in it. It was striking to me in the COVID thing that there were public health departments that would fax their information on COVID cases to the CDC. Or I don't even know how to use a fax machine. I wouldn't know what to do, and they're still using faxes. So come on. Second last area is industrial policy or advanced industry strategy, whatever you want to call it. This is going to be a big deal for the Trump administration. There's a new report that Eric Schmidt and his team commission came out with recently, a couple of days ago, former CEO of Google, calling out how our competitive advantage in technology with China is a lot more iffy than people think, which I agree with. We've got to do a better job of national policies to support technology companies, technology industries that compete with China. That's a bipartisan issue. You get people like Todd Young in Indiana, who's a Republican, who co-sponsored a bill with Chuck Schumer, and we work closely with both of them on that bill, $100 billion a year for R&D, for NSF, for 10 core technologies like quantum and AI and autonomous systems and the like. Another component of that also is, if you saw the announcement 3 days ago by the White House, a new executive order on Buy American. You can have different views of that. The reality is they're going to get much more strict on Buy American. Now, if you're an American firm, smaller, it's probably good for you. If you're a multinational, it's probably bad for you. But this is not just going to apply to the federal government who buys things. It'll apply to people who get contracts from the federal government and what they buy. And it's going to really try to ratchet that down in terms of the ability to buy things outside the U.S. I think it's overall problematic. I think it could be revised and targeted more. The last is really trade. Trump has really pushed export controls. That was kind of one of his, he had two weapons: the tariffs and export controls. I think the tariffs, ultimately will be brought down, but not in any time soon. Biden doesn't want to look weak. He's already vulnerable on China for earlier remarks he made. So I don't think he's going to go back from the phase one China deal on the tariffs too much. And export controls, I think he will. Trump really used export controls to punish the Chinese. It was one of those things, though, it was a sort of a mutual suicide pact. It hurt them, but it also hurt our companies, particularly semiconductor companies like TI and others. I don't think the Biden team is going to go down that path very hard. If they do anything on export controls, it'll be much more around what's called Wassenaar and working with our allies. Trade agreements, not much. I just don't think they have no appetite for trade agreements, at least this year, maybe even next year. USMCA is sort of in place. That's going to work its way out. But new deals, I should back up. There'll probably be a deal with the UK. It's an easy deal. The UK wants it. We want it. But us joining what was the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon. And the last area I'll just say is I think there's going to be increasing tensions with not just China, but frankly with the EU. Now, Biden team wants to make nice with Europe, wants to be Atlanticist and multilateralist, and I agree with that. But Europe's doing some terrible things, digital service taxes, and this whole tech sovereignty thing, and all these other you can't take data out of Europe anymore. Unless those get fixed, I think there's going to be increasing or ongoing tensions with Europe. So I will stop there. I see a question here on H-1B. I should have brought that up. Trump team hated H-1B. They hated immigration. I mean, look, I don't want. That's not really true. It's not that they hated immigration. They hated certain kinds of immigration, and they thought there was too much, particularly low-skill immigration. But they hated H-1Bs. They just didn't like the H-1B program at all. I don't think Biden's going to have that animus. I mean, he's already proposed something on H-1Bs. I believe this is right, where the spouses could work, which would make it easier, obviously, for H-1B. So my guess is that if Biden gets his way, there will be more liberalization of high-skill STEM immigration. The key question is, will he get his way in the Senate? Immigration is just so conflictual in the Senate right now. So, do I believe Biden will continue with Huawei sanctions? No, I do not. We already dealt with the Huawei issue in the sense that we banned Huawei and ZTE from the U.S. They're not going to sell any equipment in the U.S. So I never understood. I understood it. I never agreed with it. What's the point of going after Huawei? All we're doing, we're hurting them a little bit, but the reality is, if you look at Huawei cell phone sales, Xiaomi and other Chinese companies just took their sales. Huawei sales declined, and the Chinese other company sales increased. What have we gained by that? So I think ultimately Trump will back off from the Huawei export control. Would be my sense. I think, again, export controls are going to be more, if they do them, they're going to be much more around multilateral. I mean, that's what the Bureau of Industry and Security and Commerce is always says. If you read their thing, export controls should be done with our partners. When we didn't do that, not the only, but one of the main things that happened was that the Chinese just went to the Japanese, or they went to the Europeans, or they went to the Koreans, and we lost out, and nobody was really hurt other than us. So they're aware of that, and I think they want to go along with that approach.
Well, this is a question about the number of executive orders that have come out in the last week. What is interesting to me is the executive orders come out and on immigration, and I think probably the general public is reading those and thinking, this is fantastic. If I'm a PhD student, now I'm going to get to stay in the U.S. If I'm from outside of the U.S. But I think what's lost in some of these is they have to be enacted. I think you alluded to that then legislation has to be passed, and these legislative measures are really hard to get through Congress. And so I think sometimes they signal one thing, but the reality is something else. Same actually on Buy American. I mean, the executive order comes out and it's very, very, supportive of U.S. industry. But then at the end of the day, it's going to take legislation and regulation to actually do something tangible.
Well, I mean, I guess on the immigration thing, I think the one thing people oftentimes aren't aware of is there's generally bipartisan consensus for high skill immigration. Both parties are willing. There's enough people in both parties to go along with that. The problem is, I mean, politically, is the Democrats don't want to do that because they want to tie low skill immigration to high skill immigration. They don't want a separate deal because they know that once high skill immigration is done, the political sort of oomph to support the Democrats on what they want on low skill immigration is a lot less. So that's why for 15 years we have made virtually no progress. And there's little things here and there. There was like some bill that was trying to change so that more Indians could come because of, I don't remember the way that the country caps were set up, and industry wanted to do that. So you can play around at the margin and get things like that. But I'm skeptical that I don't think there'll be an immigration bill, and because of that, I don't think there'll be much movement on high skill. I do think, though, Barbara, that some of this stuff can be done. I mean, you look at what Trump did. He did a lot of things with executive order. So H-1B in particular, you can do that. The L-1s Trump changed on executive order. I would imagine Biden going to go back on that. Even on Buy America, there are things he can do. He doesn't have unlimited power, I guess would be, and you're right to point that out. He doesn't have, Congress still has some or a lot of control. Any priorities on investment in cybersecurity? Oh, here they are. Beautiful. All right. Yes, I think I just saw a tweet from a colleague who just got a high level or position in the State Department to help lead the cybersecurity efforts. They're going to bring in a good team on cybersecurity, I believe, and I think it's going to be a top focus, particularly after SolarWinds. It's one of those weird things where it's like eventually you kind of figure, well, eventually they're going to take it seriously, but I think now they are going to take it seriously. What that actually means, I just don't know. I would imagine, though, that one of the ways that's going to play itself out is in much more stringent cybersecurity rules and regulations for federal contracting. There may be more funding for cybersecurity. I'm just not sure exactly how that'll play out. How do organizations support broadband equity? Well, I think. So we have a podcast called Innovation Files, which see on our website. I love, obviously. We just had a guy, big angel investor out of Silicon Valley. He was at Cisco early on, and one of the guys we interviewed, he was the digital czar or whatever for the city of Detroit, and the coolest guy ever, man. He was just, what Detroit is doing is really phenomenal in my view. They have programs. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but you can see it on our website. He has this thing where he gets all the companies together, kind of like what you're doing, and he's created all these programs. Like one is where companies donate computers that you don't need anymore. When you're moving up to a new level of computers, they donate them to this organization, and then they train Detroit city residents. They train them in computer repair and software and all this stuff, and then they give them, although not free, you have to pay a little bit to have some skin in the game, to low-income families in Detroit. They're doing all this stuff on training with churches. It's really, to me, one of the best programs. He's the digital inclusion czar. I just look and see what some people like that are doing, because I think Detroit's now the mayor and this guy are probably the best in the country on this. They really figured out a good public-private partnership. So that might be something that you'd want to look at. What are the challenges in social reform legislation?
You mentioned social reform earlier, and you said that there may be some challenges towards having the legislation, but I was listening to see what the challenges are. I don't think you mentioned them later on.
I'm sorry. Yeah, a good point. So, I'll give you an example again. If you read almost any article now on facial recognition systems, the articles will say, well, we all know that they're racially biased because there was a NIST study, and therefore we should not deploy them. Okay, there's two problems with that statement. Again, if NIST evaluated these things, and what they found was, let's just say 100 systems were tested. What they found was like 15 systems had no bias. In fact, actually, one of the systems was actually better on African American women than white males by like, 0.1%, whatever, but essentially no bias. And 85 of them had bias the wrong way. They had bias towards white males. They had more accurate readings of white males than non-white males. Almost every reporter who's covered that story in the US and almost every sort of advocate who wants to push for a racial justice agenda has interpreted that as saying facial recognition is inherently biased and we shouldn't deploy it. If that were the case, I would fully support not deploying it. But it's not the case. It does not appear to be the case according to NIST. So then the next answer is, okay, if that's the case, what do you do? What you do is you basically say to jurisdictions or frankly even companies, you can't regulate them exactly the same way, but for jurisdictions and governments and I don't know, if the border folks have it or TSA have it, you have to deploy systems that have been approved by NIST, that have gone through the NIST certification, that have low or almost zero or no levels of racial bias or gender bias. My worry is that that's too nuanced for people, and it's just going to be, let's ban this stuff. Let's just ban it right off the bat because we all know. Once you get into these we all know things, we're in trouble because it's hard to go back and say, well, I actually interviewed a guy recently for our podcast who, in his book, he wrote this, and I was just like, it was a good book, by the way. It was like, I think it was called Bad Robot. It was a cool book about why we shouldn't be afraid of AI, but he had read the article. And so he just repeated what he read in the article, even though the article was wrong. So I think that's one area. The other thing is there have been some cases where you've seen initial AI deployments having bias. Like for example, Amazon had a hiring AI, and I think it was biased against women. Well, you know what Amazon did? They stopped using. First of all, they never used it to make a hire decision. They had beta on it. And they just said, no, it's biased against women. We're not going to do it. And most of the companies, if not, almost every company I've ever talked to with AI, they're not like ignorant of this issue. They know that bias is really, really important. Like we just did a podcast with this guy, Pedro Dominguez, which will be up in a few weeks. And Pedro is a AI professor at University of Washington, which is, in the top 6 computer science programs in the world. And, Pedro's view is, yeah, most systems are not biased, and you can get data sets that are not biased. So rather than, one of the things we wrote a few years ago is a report called Overcoming Data Poverty, where there is limited data on certain types of communities by demographics and also by place. Poorer communities, there's just less data. Let's fix that problem. Let's really focus on fixing that problem. And let's make sure that companies are working collaboratively and all that to address it. All to the good. But my worry is that that's not what the response will be. The response will be AI is inherently biased. You can't use it, or if you use it, you have to have open source algorithms. You have to, which is a really terrible idea in our view, But anyway, so I think that's part of how that could play out. I think the other parts of the racial justice agenda, for example, making sure that there's adequate and effective technical training for STEM skills for all groups. That's something we've argued for a long, long time. We actually wrote a report a few years ago on science high schools, STEM high schools, and we did a webinar from the museum. A live event at the museum, and we webinared in the Dallas Math and Science Academy, which at the time, I don't know what it's doing now, but at the time it was, I don't know, I'm going to say 80–90% ethnic minorities, low income, kind of working class kids. And they were on the top in the country, one of the top schools in the country in AP test excellence. Wow. If you can do that in Dallas, why can't we do that? Why aren't we doing that everywhere, I guess? And so I think it would be nice to be pushing those kinds of things as opposed to this sort of, well, this is inherently racially biased. And I worry that we're going to do the latter rather than more of the former. Why is open source a terrible idea? I didn't mean open source, and if I said that, I apologize. I meant, we're indifferent to whether open source or closed source. Whatever. It's whatever business in the market thinks is best, and there'll be different business models. What I meant was mandatory disclosure of your algorithms. If you want to disclose your algorithms because it's open source, that should be your business. But if you don't want to disclose your algorithm, in our view, the government shouldn't have the right to sort of say, well, the only way we're going to do business is to make you disclose your algorithm. So it was really more the forcing part of it.
So the question was really, when you look at the funding that was, I think it was 19 billion or 16 billion, and there's no language in there for set-asides or for the inclusion of small minority or women-owned businesses. And I called the FCC and they said, no, we didn't put that language in there. So I'm just concerned with all the D&I issues, diversity and inclusion issues that we have. I'm surprised that there's no language in there that these companies must have at least 20 to 30% inclusion of small, disabled, disadvantaged, minority, or women-owned businesses.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I should back by saying Doug Brake on our team leads all of our telecom work and is deeply involved with broadband and RDOF and all that, so he would know more about it. My understanding is that was a Pai initiative, Republican Chairman Pai. So I don't have any real intelligence, but I would expect as the Biden team goes forward, Jessica Rosenworcel is just temporary head of the SEC, that they will do something along those lines. I don't know what number it'll be, but I would expect that they're going to take that issue quite seriously compared to what Pai had done. The last administration lacked focus and knowledge of AI. Well, I don't know. I have a different view of that. I actually thought the administration did okay on AI. Michael Kratsios was the CTO. Michael had been out in Silicon Valley. They had a OMB executive order on how agencies should not overregulate AI. I think it was very, very important executive order. I mean, really important. Michael's problem in the administration was he didn't run OMB, and the guy, OMB, Mulvaney basically wanted to cut everything. And Michael was able to fight for some AI increases of funding within that budget constraint. So Lynn Parker was one of the main advisors on that. Lynn is a computer scientist who's a detailee from NSF. Lynn I just got an email from her the other day. She has been appointed to some new, more permanent position in OSTP under the Biden team. So Lynn is probably going to be doing a lot of the AI, leading a lot of the AI work in the Biden administration. And she is very, very strong, knows AI, isn't, industry unfriendly. Anyway, but yeah, there will be a focus. There's a lot of folks in the Biden world that are really into, IT and tech, and I'm sure they'll bring other folks in as well.
Hey, Rob, thank you very much. It's been a great dialogue. I've learned a lot, taken a lot of notes. Can you share again the name of the podcast that you mentioned?
Yeah, if you just go to our website, it's itif.org, and then if you click on the little publications link on the top, there's a drop-down menu, and it'll say Innovation Files, and that lists all the podcasts. So really interesting folks we've had on that podcast, from government, the private sector, all talking about different issues around tech.